Imagine you're in a car and you're driving down this incredibly rocky, just pothole-filled road.
Right, a total nightmare.
Exactly. The engine is sputtering, the steering wheel is fighting you the whole way. But somehow the ride inside the cabin feels perfectly smooth. You're practically gliding. And that's all because the shock absorbers on this car are absolute world-class engineering marvels.
I like that analogy. And, based on our sources today, the domestic politics and local bureaucracy are that rocky road. And the Nepalese diaspora are those shock absorbers, basically taking all the hits and keeping the whole vehicle moving forward.
Yeah, well said. Welcome to the Nepali Diaspora Network podcast, everyone. We are your shortcut to being well-informed on the news, views, and insights for Nepalese worldwide.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into the source material of the latest Nepali Diaspora Digest, specifically Week 21, so May 16th to the 22nd, 2026.
Yeah.
And we're unpacking a week defined by records and reckonings.
Yeah, it's been a massive week. We have high-altitude triumphs on Everest, a Supreme Court situation bypassing decades of tradition, and, like we mentioned, the immense economic weight of the global diaspora.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to look at this landscape where, domestic political paralysis in Kathmandu is being directly offset by the sheer volume of resources flowing in from the diaspora.
Which means listeners tuning in right now.
Exactly, you guys. So, okay, let's unpack how heavy that economic weight actually is. Because the numbers in the digest are wild. Between mid-March and mid-April, Nepal received over 209 billion rupees in remittances.
Which is just a massive figure to wrap your head around.
It really is. If you break that down, it comes out to roughly 7 billion rupees every single day.
Wow. Yeah, and if you look at the first 9 months of the fiscal year, total inflows hit $11.5 billion in U.S. dollars. So remittances are now projected to make up about a third of Nepal's entire GDP this year.
A third? That's huge.
Yeah. And because of this volume, the foreign exchange reserves have ballooned to over $23 billion. For a small economy, having enough reserves to cover well over a year of imports is a massive structural buffer.
Right. It's that shock absorber we were talking about.
Yeah.
And mechanically, a portion of this is driven by the depreciation of the rupee against the dollar, right? Which, automatically boosts the rupee receipts when the money lands.
Exactly. But the underlying engine, as the newsletter points out, is simply sheer volume. Hundreds of thousands of Nepalese are migrating, particularly to the Gulf and Malaysia.
And they're shifting away from informal networks like Hundi, right?
Yeah, they're sending more money home through formal banking channels instead, which is why we're seeing these record official numbers.
And here's where it gets complicated. There's a huge irony in the source material. Non-resident Nepalese, or NRNs, are literally underwriting the country's economic survival. But there is significant backlash right now against the draft NRN Act 2026.
Right, we're seeing this from groups like NRNA New Zealand, for instance.
Because the draft bill actually threatens to strip NRN ID holders of their political and voting rights.
Which is quite the disconnect. The state seems more than happy to accept the capital, but deeply hesitant to grant the political enfranchisement that, usually accompanies it.
It's essentially taxation without representation. And the people generating these billions are navigating a maze of bureaucratic hurdles before they even leave the country.
Oh, absolutely. The friction starts long before they board a plane.
Yeah, particularly for the largest destination for outbound Nepalese workers, which is Malaysia.
Right. Just for context, nearly 250,000 Nepalese workers went to Malaysia in a single recent year.
250,000.
Yeah, so any shift in the rules in that labor corridor dictates the lives of hundreds of thousands of families.
Which brings us to this recent notice. The Malaysian embassy in Kathmandu just issued a document clarifying the biomedical system, or BMS, health screening rules.
Right, medical checks.
Yeah. So now there are 36 authorized clinics where a migrant worker can get this mandatory screening. There's a 3,000 rupee service charge. But crucially, and this is the big part, the Malaysian employer must bear all these BMS-related costs and reimburse the worker in their first month's salary.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this clarity actually disrupts a deeply entrenched cottage industry of exploitation.
Oh, how so?
Well, previously, unauthorized clinics and middlemen were operating in all this ambiguity. They were charging migrant aspirants arbitrary fees for medical checks that weren't even recognized.
Oh, wow. So just taking their money for a fake test.
Or double charging them, yeah. The mechanism was essentially a toll booth operated by bad actors extracting wealth from the very people trying to build it.
But I have to ask about the timeline here, though, because the source material notes that the bilateral labor agreement anchoring this policy was signed way back in October 2018.
Yeah.
It is now 2026. A one-page document clarifying that employers have to pay for a medical test took 8 years to materialize. I mean, is that a failure of diplomacy or just deeply entrenched bureaucratic friction?
It's often intentional friction. The Nepal-Malaysia labor corridor has historically been plagued by vested interests. So middlemen and unregulated health check providers benefited immensely from that lack of enforcement.
So they wanted it to be vague.
Exactly. It took years of sustained pressure from rights groups, migrant advocates, and diaspora-funded organizations to force the bureaucratic apparatus to actually implement the terms they agreed to on paper almost a decade ago.
It's crazy. So the government struggles for nearly a decade to protect outgoing workers from predatory systems. Yet, looking at the domestic economy, they are equally paralyzed when it comes to regulating incoming foreign business.
Right, which brings us to the tech sector.
Yeah, Uber has officially, or well, perhaps unofficially landed in Kathmandu.
Unofficially is probably the right word. Our sources show Uber executed a soft launch in the Kathmandu Valley, offering both bike and car rides. They've onboarded about 1,000 drivers ahead of a formal launch on June 1st.
And for the diaspora, the appeal is obvious. You land at Tribhuvan International Airport, and you can open the same app you use in Sydney or Texas to get a ride.
It's super convenient, but the Department of Industry confirmed that Uber hasn't actually filed a formal Foreign Direct Investment, or FDI, application.
Which is wild. It's like moving into a new apartment by just sliding your furniture through the window without actually signing a lease with the landlord. You get to live there, but your name isn't on the paperwork if someone comes knocking.
That is the exact mechanism they're using. Uber formed a back-office partnership with a local company called Kathmandu.
Okay.
So Kathmandu handles the driver onboarding, the local tech coordination, and the dispute resolution. Uber, the app, is live, but Uber, the corporate entity, hasn't committed to the FDI paperwork or the legal liability in Nepal.
And regulators are watching this closely, right?
Yeah, because it creates a test case. If a global tech giant can enter the market through a local proxy without registering as a foreign entity, it changes the entire framework for how digital businesses operate in the country.
And what's interesting is local businesses in Nepal don't have the luxury of using back doors when dealing with international rules.
Yeah.
Take the Orthodox tea growers in Ilam.
Right, the tea industry.
Yeah, we're talking about a 6 billion rupee export trade here. Orthodox tea, for those unfamiliar, is the premium traditional hand-rolled leaf. It's not like the mass-produced crushed tea you find in standard tea bags.
Right, it's a very high-value product.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But India recently imposed a mandatory lab testing rule requiring all imported tea to be tested at a central lab in Kolkata.
Which acts as a massive non-tariff barrier. I mean, imagine a truck full of premium tea sitting at the border in the summer heat for days, awaiting lab results from a facility hundreds of miles away. It severely degrades the quality of the product.
Thankfully, our sources note the tea board in India eventually backed down, relaxing the rules so tea sold within India is now exempt. So the trucks are moving again. But it exposed a profound vulnerability.
Definitely. Roughly 90% of Nepal's premium Orthodox leaf goes to India. So the sudden implementation of that lab test proved that a single buyer controlling the border can just turn off the tap on a 6 billion rupee industry overnight with one administrative memo.
It is pure geopolitical leverage.
It is.
Which explains why growers and policymakers are actively courting Chinese interest in Ilam tea gardens right now. It isn't just about expanding into a new market. It is an insurance policy against relying on a single neighbor.
And we see that reliance everywhere. For instance, Indian state oil companies just raised fuel prices by 3%. Since Nepal imports its entire fuel supply from India, transport and food prices across the country will inevitably spike in the coming weeks.
Yeah, the ripple effects are huge.
But, you know, the vulnerability to sudden administrative shifts isn't just external. The tradition and rules governing the highest levels of Nepal's own government are currently being rewritten in real time.
Yeah, particularly within the judiciary. This was a massive story in the Digest.
It really was.
The swearing in of Dr. Manoj Kumar Sharma as Nepal's 33rd Chief Justice by President Ramchandra Paul completely bypassed the traditional line of succession.
Right.
The Constitutional Council, which is chaired by Prime Minister Bailan Shah, picked Sharma, who was ranked 4th in seniority.
4th.
Yeah, fourth, they bypassed 3 more senior justices,
Mm.
including acting Chief Justice Sapanapradhan Malla. Furthermore, despite 16 complaints filed against Sharma, the Parliamentary Hearing Committee dismissed all of them in a single sitting and endorsed him unanimously.
And the mechanics of how this happened are crucial to understand the backlash. Now, as a reminder, we are just imparting what the original source material is out here. We aren't taking any side.
Of course, just reporting what the digest says.
Right. So the Constitutional Council had been deadlocked for 8 months under the previous coalition. To break it, the current government under PM Balan Shah utilized the Constitutional Council First Amendment Ordinance.
Wait, an ordinance?
Yeah, this effectively changed the voting structure and quorum requirements, allowing the Prime Minister to push the appointment through. And in doing so, it shattered a seniority convention that has governed Supreme Court succession since the 1990 Constitution.
Wow. Now, the digest mentions that the current government has a sweeping mandate of 182 seats in Parliament. So one could argue that government with that kind of majority has the prerogative and perhaps the duty to break an 8-month judicial deadlock to get the country moving. I mean, if the system is paralyzed, sometimes you have to break a convention to restore functionality.
And that is exactly the core argument from the executive branch, that our sources outline that endless paralysis is worse than ruffled feathers.
But the Bar Association sees it differently.
Yes, the counter-argument from the Nepal Bar Association centers entirely on the independence of the judiciary. The Seniority Convention existed specifically to prevent the executive branch from dangling the Chief Justice position as a political reward.
Ah, I see.
So their perspective is that if the court is perceived as being handpicked by the Prime Minister through an ordinance, it fundamentally compromises its neutrality.
And for a listener sitting in London or Texas right now, the makeup of that court is deeply relevant to you. The Supreme Court is the final venue for cases involving diaspora property rights and NRN citizenship petitions.
Exactly.
They also handle complex domestic issues, like the Kamalpokari Guthi land dispute, which concerns traditional community land trusts that have deep cultural and historical significance. So if the judiciary is viewed as an extension of the executive branch, it alters the legal calculus for anyone seeking justice against the state.
And this institutional friction extends straight into the legislature, too. The parliament itself is currently gridlocked.
Yeah. Opposition MPs from the Nepali Congress, the CPNUML, and the newly formed Shram Sanskrit Party have been picketing the will of the House.
Right.
They are demanding PM Balan Shah resign, accusing his administration of avoiding parliamentary scrutiny by governing through these very ordinances.
Meanwhile, the constitutional deadline to present the upcoming fiscal year budget is looming, yet budget meetings are postponed and the finance minister hasn't even been allowed to speak.
That's incredibly stressful. And the economic reality on the ground is grim. The finance ministry just slashed fiscal transfers to the provinces down to roughly 21%.
Wow.
But more concerning is the capital spending. This is the money the government's supposed to use to actually build infrastructure and develop the country. With only 2 months left in the fiscal year, capital spending sits at just under 28%.
So barely a quarter of the development budget has actually been spent.
Yeah.
This execution gap is usually tied up in contractor disputes, delayed project approvals, and political instability at the ministerial level. Finance Secretary Ghanshyam Upadhyaya has explicitly signaled that the upcoming budget will heavily lean on private investment.
Basically openly admitting that government spending is failing to drive productivity.
Right. The state is essentially telling the private sector and the diaspora that they must shoulder the burden of growth.
And local governance is marching forward with its own aggressive mandates, right? Like the intensified drive against illegal construction along the Bagmati River, with demolitions now pushing deep into the Kapan neighborhood.
Yeah, it paints a picture of intense institutional battles and economic anxiety across the board.
It really does. But contrasting sharply with all that institutional gridlock is the sheer individual resilience we are seeing on the global stage.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going to start at the highest possible altitude.
Everest.
Yes. The spring 2026 Everest season delivered 3 historic records. Kami Rita Sherpa reached the summit for the 32nd time, extending his own world record.
Unbelievable.
And that same morning, Lhakpa Sherpa reached the summit for the 11th time, extending her record for the most ascents by any woman.
And she's lived in Hartford, Connecticut for over 2 decades, right?
Yes, making this a massive triumph for the diaspora. And then a staggering 274 climbers summited in a single day on May 20th.
274. The mechanism behind that many people summiting at once is entirely about weather windows.
Right.
When the weather clears for only a brief period, every expedition pushes for the top simultaneously. And economically, the mountain is generating record revenue.
How much are we talking?
Well, the Department of Tourism issued unprecedented numbers of permits, bringing in nearly $6 million from Everest alone. That's driven by the new $15,000 per climber fee. Total royalties across all peaks hit 1.24 billion rupees.
That's massive. But the man whose 32 summits are the global benchmark issued a warning. Commie Rita Sherpa is publicly calling on the government to cap Everest permits.
Because of the bottlenecks, right?
Exactly. When everyone pushes at once during those narrow weather windows, the bottleneck near the summit becomes incredibly dangerous. So it forces a critical policy question. Does the government prioritize the billion rupees in tourism revenue, or do they cap the permits to prioritize human life and the sustainability of the mountain?
It is another instance of those on the ground, or in this case, on the mountain, having to push back against state policy to ensure basic functionality and safety.
Well said.
And we saw the exact same dynamic play out on the football pitch recently.
Oh yes, the All-Nepal Football Association, or ANFA, was staring down a 4-year funding ban from FIFA, the global governing body of football.
Yeah, and this was due to a bitter government interference dispute involving the National Sports Council, right?
Exactly. Because of this bureaucratic infighting, the women's national team was on the verge of being pulled from the upcoming SAF Championship, the South Asian Football Federation tournament.
It was institutional brinkmanship threatened to destroy years of athletic preparation.
But at the last possible minute, Education and Sports Minister Sasmit Pokharel stepped in and revoked the suspension. Almost immediately, FIFA lifted the ban, unblocking millions in forward program money and clearing the women's team to compete.
That's such a relief.
Huge relief. And combine that with the men's national cricket team sweeping their recent series against the USA and Scotland at Kirtipur, and players like Asif Sheikh and Dipendra Singh Airy cracking the International Cricket Council's top 100 one-day international batting rankings.
It just goes to show, when you clear away the bureaucratic obstacles, the talent immediately performs on a global level.
Yeah. Looking at the football save, the cricket wins, and the records on Everest, it really feels like the talent is fighting their own domestic institutions just as hard as they are fighting the competition or the elements.
The people are consistently outperforming the systems meant to support them.
They really are. Now, before we wrap up today's deep dive, we want to share a community resource for our listeners in the UK. If you are looking to connect locally, check out belayat.uk. That's belayat.uk. It is a fantastic hub for the Nepalese community to find jobs, sort out housing, discover local events, and support Nepalese-owned businesses across the UK.
It's built for the community, by the community, so give belayat.uk a look if you are navigating life over there.
Definitely. And platforms like that showcase the quiet structural strength of the diaspora, you know.
Yeah, which actually leads to a final thought I want to leave you with this week, something to ponder.
Oh, let's hear it.
So, the global diaspora's economic power has grown to the point where they are sending home 7 billion rupees a day. They are the shock absorbers, keeping the macroeconomy from collapsing.
Right, like we said at the beginning.
Exactly. But at what point does that undeniable economic leverage translate into actual political influence? Regardless of what the draft NRN bill attempts to restrict, a group cannot serve as the primary economic engine of a nation indefinitely without eventually demanding a hand on the steering wheel.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, how long can the political leadership ignore the very people keeping the vehicle intact?
A brilliant question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We want you to keep exploring these stories, so please visit nepalidiaspora.net to read the full digest, get the latest updates, and access more resources for the community.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Until next time, stay curious and stay connected.